Spirit of God, open our hearts and our minds that we may hear you, and lifting the veil that we may be free. Amen. As I'm sure you can imagine, the day of a person's ordination is an extraordinary day. It is quite literally the culmination of years, in my case, 7 years of studying, classes, an infinite amount of papers written, internships, apostolates, summer internships, retreats, all coming into one day. And it really is the day that you work towards for all of those years. So I've seen in my time of having witnessed other men become ordained, a whole host of emotions. Everything from tears of joy to humility to just an incredible sense of success and accomplishment and just happiness. And I experienced all of those things on the day of my ordination, but I experienced one thing that I remember I really didn't anticipate. There's a part of the ordination rite in which you lie prostrate before the altar. It's a symbol and an act of humility and surrender to God. And I remember being in that moment, lying there as they were singing the Litany of the Saints and just being completely overwhelmed, not with joy, not with humility, but with a complete and utter sense of inadequacy. I remember laying on that floor and saying to myself, or actually to God, over and over again, God, you have to help me with this. You've got to help me with this because what you're asking me to do, I cannot do on my own. I don't have what it takes. And I remember praying over and over, you've got to help me with this. You've got to help me with this. God, you have to help me do this. Because I felt at that moment that I would not be able to do what God was calling me to do. I felt that I wouldn't be able to feed the people that God was calling me to feed. And I reflected on that moment many, many years ago, often in my ministry. And as I've thought about it, and I've done ministry over these years, I've really realized a couple of things. First, in that sense of inadequacy, of not being able to do these things, I was 100% right. I was 100% right that on my own, I would not have enough to feed God's people. I wouldn't have enough to do what God was asking me to do. And the second thing that I learned was when I stopped focusing on what I felt I couldn't do and began to focus on what God could do through me, that's when ministry started to happen. That's when I could begin to see God working through me. See, what I had to do, what I had to realize is that I had to get out of God's way and realize that this is not about me. It's not about what I have or about what I don't have. As long as I made the question and the answer and success about me and what I did, it would never be enough. And I would always be afraid, and I would always feel inadequate. You see, when we realize that the answer to our hunger, and to our loneliness, and to our grieving, and to the passing of those that we love, the answer to our financial fears that keep us up at night, our crumbling or barely breathing relationships, that the answers to these things do not ultimately lie with us. Then and only then, when we turn these things over to God, then what we have becomes enough, because Christ makes it enough. Then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated, so also the fish, as much as they wanted. See, that's what's happening in the gospel today. Too often we as people focus on what we don't have, what we're missing, what we think isn't going to be enough, how we don't measure up. The disciples said in the gospel to Jesus, Lord, where are we going to get enough food to feed them? Half a year's salary will not be enough. What is 5 loaves and 2 fish going to do? We don't have enough to give. And what Jesus is really trying to say to them in his response is this: get out of my way. If you give to me what you think is not enough, I will give you back more than you thought you could ever have, and then some. Jesus took the loaves. He prayed, and suddenly there was more than they needed. See, Jesus tells us this over and over again in the Gospels. We just forget the lesson. He tells us with God all things are possible. If you ask anything in my name, it will be given to you. Apart from me, you can do nothing. As long as we focus on what we don't have, on what we feel is missing in our life, or how insufficient we are, as long as we do that, we'll never have enough. We'll never feel like our life is filled up. Now, what is the first thing that Jesus does after he takes the bread? The very first thing he does, he gives thanks. He gives thanks for the little that they have. Jesus sees what they have and he's grateful for it. He doesn't see what is lacking. He knows 5 loaves and 2 fish on their own won't be enough to feed the crowd. But he doesn't focus on what is lacking, only what is, and he sees it and he recognizes it as gift. Gratitude. The recognizing as gift of all that we have, small or large. Gratitude, when what we have and who we have measures up to what we expect, and especially when they do not. Some people tend to see through the lens of what is missing, what is insufficient, what is less than they feel they deserve, what is inadequate in their life, what should be and how people around them should act. Gratitude. Gratitude for the gifts we have been given, perfect and most often imperfect, is powerful in God's eyes because it then shows God that we are looking at the world as God sees it. Gratitude, my brothers and sisters, moves the heart of God. You see, God makes things happen when we get out of the way. And very often God chooses to act with the hands and the words of those around us. God can, and sometimes does, answer our questions by sudden revelation, a sudden burst of wisdom, a passage in the Bible that we read that suddenly sheds light on a question that we have or a situation that we're in, a sign that comes out of nowhere. It does happen. But very often, I would say most often, God will speak and answer and reveal through the voices, the actions, and the presence people. Ordinary, everyday people. And we can miss it because we want the mystical. We want the one-on-one word from God. It's usually how we picture God speaking. But it's what St. Paul is trying to describe in Ephesians. I pray that you may know the love of Christ. To him be the glory who, by the power at work within us, is able to accomplish far more than we can ever ask or imagine. So how does Paul say that God accomplishes his work? By the power at work within us. In the gospel, God gives to overflowing abundance because what they have is surrendered to Jesus. But also there's that very interesting and curious little line that he has them first sit into groups of 50 and 100. See, this is Mark's way of describing how God works in communities, in church, through each other. See, if people were separated, they would have taken food only for themselves and their families. When they came together, they shared what they had. The loaves that were given to them, as well as the food that most likely they had already with them. You see, when we're face to face with people, it's much harder to keep back and to hold back because there's a person in front of us. So the person from the next village or the next town or the next country suddenly becomes not just an idea, but a person real in front of us. It's hard to hold back dread. It's hard to hold back compassion when you're looking at a person's face. See, it's when we lock ourselves into our own private world that others suffer, and we suffer as well, because then we can't hear God. There is an example given in the gospel today. What you need, what you are asking for, what you feel is missing in your life, what is not enough in your life, hand it over to Christ. Just as the loaves and the fishes were handed over. Place it in his hands. And when you do that, then give thanks. Give thanks for what you do have, for what God has already given you. And if you look at your life carefully, and you don't even really have to look that hard, you will find rather quickly that you already have enough. But God will give you what you need and more if you surrender it to him, if you trust God, and if you're grateful for what God has given you. So surrender. Hand it over, trusting and believing. Be grateful for your gifts. You will have everything that you need and more. Amen.